Hi, this is Buzz Ely, and the date is August 19th, 2021. And I'm going to ask Betty Ann Ely some questions about her childhood and her growing up and her family, etc. And so here's the first question. What is your very first memory?
This is Elizabeth Ann Ely, actually Bone Smith Ely, and I am married to Buzz. And this is really about my family. And the first question that Buzz asked me was my earliest memory. And I was maybe 4.5, and we were living in 139 Lanark Street in Winnipeg, in Canada. And I remember my mother, who was pregnant, falling down the porch steps. She was pregnant with Linda. At the time, I don't know gestationally how pregnant she was, but I can remember even what clothing she was wearing. Interesting how memories that are traumatic like that stick with you.
So now the second question is going to be, what was your neighborhood like? So, you can talk about, walking to school or whatever you want to do or whatever.
The neighborhood we lived in Winnipeg was referred to as River Heights. It was a suburban type neighborhood. There was a main street, and then there were what we call bays. They were like U bays that went off from the main street, and we lived on the first bay. And I lived there. I was born in Winnipeg, and I lived there until I was 13. And my father was transferred to Ottawa then with the government. He worked for the Department of Transport and was a pilot, a bush pilot, and was in charge of plane transportation in Winnipeg at that time. And this was a promotion for him. The neighborhood was, I'd say, middle class. Most everybody had one car, as we did. It was an old Ford. I remembered it was black. My mother didn't drive, so when my father was away, the car just sat generally at the airport waiting for my dad to get back. And they were mostly young families with kids our ages, and the elementary school was maybe 12 or 15 blocks away, Sir John Franklin, and we walked to that school every morning, and we walked back for lunch, and then we walked back again for the afternoon of school, and then walked back at 3:30 or 4 o'clock. So things were safe then, at least we thought they were, and weren't threatened by walking alone with friends. I had two friends, Judy Gunn, who lived at the other end of the first bay, and my other friend Eleanor, who lived, the alley was behind our house, and she lived just down the alley in the second bay. And so we all walked to school together the years that I lived there.
So, what was your relationship like with your parents, and did you know your grandparents at all?
My relationship with my grandparents was non existent. My father's father was dead, and my father's mother was still in London, England. But I never talked to her or ever met her. She died when I was, I don't know, around 10 years old, I think. My mother's parents were both gone, so I didn't know them at all either. Um, let's see, my relationship with my parents. My mother was a very passive woman and very dependent on my dad for anything, any decisions being made. He did all the financial things. My mother would walk to the grocery store to get minimal groceries that she needed until he got home, and they could go in the car. But she was a stay-at-home mom. She didn't discipline us much. It was always wait till your dad gets home if we did something naughty. My father was typically British and brought up in the British way. He was domineering and very strict, and used physical punishment. He's shaved with a straight razor, so he had this long piece of leather that he sharpened his razor with, and that's what we got hit on our little bottoms with if we had been really naughty. When we got older, I'd say in our teens, if we were disrespectful, talk back, that kind of thing, it was called cuffing, and they used the outside part of their hand to strike you in the head. And we all hated that because, first of all, it hurt. And now that I'm an adult, I feel like that was dangerous anyway. But that was the way he was raised, and that's what he knew. He was loving in his own way, but he wasn't soft, if you know what I mean. He was strict, and things were pretty black and white in our house as far as right and wrong, that kind of thing. I was a middle child, and it sounds like every other middle child, but I remember my sister Pat, who was 2.5 years older than me, was his darling. He just thought she couldn't do any wrong. And we weren't jealous of her. I don't think Linda was either, but it was, I thought obvious. Linda was the little one, and she was kind of my mother's favorite. And I always felt like the middle child, like, you're really not anybody's favorite. But I'm sure that wasn't true. My father, when I developed seizures at age 9, I developed grand mal seizures. He was very disturbed by that. And I remember overhearing he and my mother talking, and he drank a fair amount at that time and would come home from a trip, and they would sit at the kitchen table and talk when we were in bed. And I remember overhearing him that he was very disturbed with those. He called them fits, which anybody with a seizure hates that word. But that it was hard for him to accept the fact that I was different and what was going to become of me when I got older. Could I work? Could I have children? All that kind of thing. And that, listening to that talk was very disturbing to me. So disturbing that even at that young age, I started reading things I could get in the library about seizures and epilepsy and what it was. And when I was, I think 10, maybe 10 and a half, I made an appointment with our family doctor who lived in our neighborhood. His name was Dr. Loudon. And I made an appointment with him and went in there by myself and talked to him about my fears of not ever being able to get married and not having children. And could I work? What kind of nurses? I knew then I wanted to be a nurse. What kind of nurse could I be? That kind of thing. He was a wonderful man. He was, I remember him as being middle-aged. He was probably in his 40s then. And being very compassionate and understanding, and telling me not to rush to any judgment, that sometimes seizures were not with you all your life because nobody really knew what started them. And he reassured me to continue to follow my aspirations of being a nurse and just let my life unfold 1 year at a time. And I still am grateful to him for that reassurance.
So from what I hear, you did have siblings, and tell us a little bit more about them and what it was like growing up with them.
Well, growing up with two sisters it was a busy household. Like I think I previously said, Pat was kind of the favored one, and my father was just very proud of anything that she accomplished and did. That changed as she became an adolescent. She was very rebellious and created a lot of commotion in the house. Linda was younger and a sweet little sister. We mostly played in our own backyards, or we would, in the bay was just forested. It was just trees and wild plants and that kind of thing. And we would play in there and, have forts and that sort of thing as young kids. But it was a pretty sheltered, safe sort of upbringing. There were a lot of kids in our neighborhood, both on the main street and in the bays, so there was always things going on with kids. We had a swing set in the backyard, and we played a lot there in a sandbox, I remember. And each community had community gardens, and we would walk there before dinner or after dinner to water our little plot and pull weeds and that sort of thing. And I think that really started my love of gardening, to really watch plants grow and then bring them to your table to eat. I thought was pretty magical. My father was away a lot with his job, and he was in charge of flying in the western states. And so if there was a bad plane crash, he had to go and investigate it. And so my mother was home a lot with three little girls. And as I said before, she didn't drive. So we didn't go anywhere. We pretty much, as a family, stayed put. A lot of people in our neighborhood had lake lots that they built cabins on and would spend with their children the whole summer at their lake. And we didn't have that. So we didn't have the going away type treat of other places. We pretty much were tied to our home on Lanark Street and whatever friends were left in the neighborhood for the summer. My two friends both had their parents had lake lots, and so they were gone mostly all summer, which I remember really being envious of that we couldn't do that.
So, what kind of food did you like growing up? And did you have a favorite meal?
My mother was not a great cook. She was an okay cook because she didn't really like cooking. But she, was a kind of mom that made cookies for us and, always a birthday cake, that kind of thing. And my father was British, so he liked a lot of organ meats because he was raised on them in England. And I remember at least once a week we had liver and bacon and onions. And that was one of my favorite meals, actually. But our very favorite was on Sundays. We would have a roast chicken or we would have a roast beef. And the roast beef, my mother always made Yorkshire pudding with it and a potato dish, that sort of thing. So she, had the basics down. But when she was growing up, her mother became ill with what sounded to me like a dementia. And my grandfather had a fair amount of money, but when she was in college, she went to Stansted College. He had to call her home because he was running out of money. He had hired registered nurses to take care of my grandmother, which probably wasn't necessary, but he loved her and he wanted to give her the best, but it was costing him all of his savings. So he brought my mother home from college so she could help take care of her mother. So she didn't really learn from anybody as far as how to cook or how to clean a house and do laundry and that kind of thing. She just learned by living it. But my favorite was the roast beef dinner on Sunday, or the roast chicken, because it was really a complete meal. And she made very good gravy and, the added things. I remember being introduced to horseradish with roast beef and just loving it even as a small kid. We did have that little garden, so in the summer months we did have some fresh vegetables, really great carrots, I remember those, and peas that you shelling peas, we grew those, and if I got to help my mother shell them, I just ate my share right then and there. And I would still do that if I had the connection to a pan of peas. Anyway, pretty, like I say, my father was British. He loved, raw oysters. And I remember him cooking tongue and brain and, other things, heart. And as kids, even then, little kids, we absolutely wouldn't eat it. It just made him so furious, but we just was not a familiar thing for us, I guess. And when we got even just as little kids, 4 and 5 years old, when we realized what a heart was and things like that, we would then not touch what he had made for us, because he always cooked those organ meats, because my mother didn't like to do that. Turkey dinner at Thanksgiving, that was always a real big favorite too. But just pretty much routine stuff, other than my dad's love for organ meats. We weren't forced to eat it, but I can remember one Easter sitting around the table that my mother had cooked rabbit, and the timing was certainly off because we were all into the Easter Bunny. So that dinner was a total disaster, but I still remember being sent to bed without any dinner at all. All 3 of us were, because we wouldn't eat the Easter Bunny.
So, who were your favorite role models and why?
Okay, role models. That's kind of a hard one. I don't know what turned me on to being a nurse, but I still remember at a very young age, maybe 4 or so, wanting to be a nurse. I got a nurse's set for Christmas, and I loved that. But there was just something that in me told me that, I wanted to be a nurse and take care of patients that were really sick in the hospital. I didn't have grandparents, and my mother had one brother, Harold, and he lived in Quebec somewhere, and my father had one sister, and she was in England, and we never met her. So I didn't really have family people that could be role models. My friend Eleanor, who lived down the alley in the next bay, her mother was a nurse. And I remember being over playing with her, and the mother would be getting ready for work. She did private duty nursing, and putting on a white uniform and her white hose and her white shoes, and thinking, confirming, yes, that's what I want to do. But I didn't really have any formal mentoring for that. In those days, women that went to work were sort of nurses, or they were teachers, or they were secretaries. There wasn't a lot of choice. But again, my desire to be a nurse somehow came from my own self. And I really didn't have a mentor for nursing until I really got into the nursing program at the university.
So, do you remember any favorite celebrities, favorite TV shows, movies, songs, things that really stick with you from the past? And I do understand you did have a favorite doll at that time.
My favorite doll was Maggie Muggins, my Aunt Tanny, who was my mother's aunt, so she was my great aunt, would come and eat dinner with us on Sundays. And somehow she introduced me to the book set of Maggie Muggins. And they were all, a book about a little girl and a favorite man in her neighborhood named Mr. Mascarity. And it was all lessons that he taught her. And so, yes, my favorite doll was Maggie Muggins. And when I went off to college, I packed that in a trunk along with my other favorite things that I couldn't take. And unfortunately, when I think I had just graduated from college. My mother had a flood in her basement, and that trunk was part of that flood, and a lot of my belongings, including my doll, they were made of kind of wood chips glued together, so she sort of dissolved with the water. What was the rest of the question now? Favorite
TV shows.
TV shows.
movies.
And yes, we always watched Ed Sullivan on Sunday night. That was a treat because he had a lot of entertainment on. And of course, Elvis, when I was a teenager, I remember that vividly. My father being so disapproving of Elvis because he shook his hips, for Pete's sake. What he would think of the things we watch now, but and the songs, the Everly Brothers, and all of Elvis's songs, and the things that young teenagers identified with. I still remember a lot of those artists, like I say, Everly Brothers, and all of Elvis's songs. That was before the Beatles, for sure.
What was the world like when you grew up, and what major newsworthy events happened during your childhood?
I remember I was born in 1941, but I remember even as a little kid having rations and stamps for butter and cheese and milk, and my mother trading stamps with the neighbors if they didn't use butter or whatever, they would trade their stamps. We had disaster drills. The siren would go off and we would have to turn all the lights off in the house and pretend there was bombing coming. And we would, sit at our kitchen table with all the lights off and say if this was real now, we would be under the beds and we would enact a real bombing. There were bomb shelters in most of the neighborhoods, and my parents knew where they were, and knew how to get us there. They talked about it, and I can't give you an exact year, but I know I was quite small, maybe 3 or 4, and remembering the milkman bringing the milk and the dairy products to our house. We had a little chute and they would put them in. My mother would put the ration stamps and some money in there. We always had enough to eat, and my mother was very creative with, even though she wasn't, a super cook, she was very creative cook. And I think all the women had to be, because so many things were rationed or just simply not available. My mother, when I was at age 9, the physician taking care of me was trying to figure out why I had developed seizures, and he put it down to a milk and peanut allergy. And so for several years, I wasn't allowed any dairy products. And my mother really felt sorry for me, bless her heart, because she would make some wonderful dessert, a pudding or something, and I couldn't have it. So she worked very hard to develop some recipes that I could have. And I still remember a chocolate cake she would make, and there wasn't any dairy in it. And even as a little kid at age 9, I was very grateful for my mother for the extra work that she had to go through to make sure I had a treat now and then too. But that lasted for several years that I couldn't have ice cream or some of the favorite things. But again, my mother tried to make that up for me.
What was the most difficult part of your childhood?
The difficult part started when I was 9, when I started having grand mal seizures. Back in those days, they called them fits, and they never knew, they were sort of connected with mental problems as well. They weren't well understood, and watching a grand mal seizure is really kind of scary for the well person. And I had one in school when I was maybe 9 or 10. And I remember still the nurse, I could see her. I can just see her. She was probably in her 50s. And she brought me home from the gym class where I had my seizure and told my mother that I had frightened all the kids and that she needed to discipline me and not bring me back to school until she had done that. And I remember thinking, I don't know what I did to start this fit. I hated them, and I would lose consciousness and wake up and know that I had had one. I had a total of 5, which isn't very many because when I went off to college, I was 17 going on 18. And my neurologist, his name was George Moncton, and I can see him as plain as day. But the university turned me down because I had put seizures on my application, and they did not want the liability, even though the neurologist said the chances of me having a seizure were pretty slim at that time. I hadn't had one since I was 14. And I would stay on my medication throughout the years at university. George Moncton went to the board and petitioned for me, and they finally allowed me in. He asked me, if the University of Alberta doesn't accept you, what will you do? And I remember answering him that I would go to the Winnipeg General hospital plan, and I would lie about my seizures. I simply wouldn't disclose them. And that got me into the University of Alberta. I did have to sign something that said if I did have a seizure, I would quietly drop out. So it was intimidating, not knowing what caused my seizures, whether I would have another one. Like I said, I had my first one at age 9, my last one at age 14. So they were not frequent, and I had been worked up thoroughly at the Winnipeg General Hospital for brain tumors and all the other things that would cause seizures. My EEG, we didn't have CAT scans or MRIs then, but we did have an EEG, and that did show scar tissue in my brain, which was probably from a traumatic birth, my traumatic birth. My mother was in labor and wanted to push, and at that time, her doctor, whose name was Dr. Best, was in a staff meeting, a medical staff meeting, and they would not disturb him. So they put my mother's legs down, put a clamp over her perineum, and I had to wait against nature until he came from his meeting. And that's probably when I sustained a brain bleed, which has always been on all of my EEGs. I have not had another seizure since, again, the age of 14. I remember my neurologist, Dr. Moncton, when I was graduating from nursing, I went to him and said, I want to move away. And how do I do that being tied to you and medical care with this medication I have to take? I was taking phenobarbital and Dilantin twice a day. And he said, let's just stop this nonsense. You don't need that medication. Just you and I will know. Go pick up your medication every month at the dispensary. The hospital dispensed my medicine to me. And he said, just continue to pick it up so they think you're taking it. But don't take it, and we'll just play it from there. It was quite a chance, because being a senior, having a seizure, and then having to drop out would have been terrible. But, it all worked out. I never had another seizure, and I had a drawer full of medication when I graduated that I had never taken. So I was one of the fortunate ones, but it was very hard being a kid and not being allowed to have a bike, or not being allowed to swim or do so many of the activities that my friends did, because of the chance that I might have a seizure on a bike. And it was all to protect me physically, but it was very hard emotionally to feel different. And I've always felt that, as awful kind of as those years were, that it did prepare me to be a good nurse and a compassionate nurse, and one that realized what it felt like to be different.
Do you have a favorite memory from your childhood?
My favorite memories from childhood were always Christmases. My mother loved Christmas, and as domineering as my dad was, my mother was in charge of Christmas. And she would send my father out to get a tree, and I swear it happened every year. He would bring it home, and it didn't suit my mother. It wasn't big enough. It wasn't bushy enough. Whatever. My father would go back and get another tree, and some Christmases we had 2 or 3 trees. We only put up one, but you'd think after years my father would realize what kind of tree my mother wanted, but it was this little conflict that as kids we all just remembered and would giggle and laugh behind the couch as they went back and forth about the tree. The tree was special, and my mother made that special. She made a special cocoa as we were decorating the tree, and we had treats that we never had the rest of the year. My Aunt Tanny always came over for Christmas, and her gift was, other than Santa Claus's gift, was always very special. It was in a coat box, and there would be 5 or 6 gifts in there, and we always saved that one for last. Santa Claus always had an unwrapped gift under the tree for us. As little kids, we got our doll that year, and it was always in a little bed or a high chair. My mother made Christmas really special for us. And, just about every year she would forget a gift, and we would be ready to have breakfast. The rule was that we could get up and we could open our stocking, but then we had to have breakfast. And she'd say, "Oh, I forgot something." And she'd run down to her trunk in the basement and come up. I remember one year we all got a Bible. And that was, I think, when we were even eating lunch that year, she had forgotten. But it was a very special time. Most of the time, most Christmases, my father was home. And so the whole family was together. My dad insisted that Boxing Day, which was the 26th of December in Canada, we didn't leave the house. We spent that day with our gifts and our family, and enjoyed a big turkey dinner and just each other. And I kind of continued those things with my own children as they grew up, and I have to smile when I see them making their kids sit down and eat their sourdough pancakes before they go on to opening their presents. That's what we always did in our household.
Time it was, and what a time it was. A time of innocence, a time of confidences. Long ago it must be, I have a photograph. Preserve your memories, they're all that's left you.
today I'm going to ask you some questions about your relationships and your love lives. And the first question is, did you have a first crush? And then who was it? And did you ever act on it? Say, wait, you can start talking.
My love life, this is sort of personal, Buzz, but
Right.
when I was 14, I had this crush on this college student that I had sort of seen on the bus going to college. And in those days for transportation, we took the bus everywhere. And so I watched where he got off, and he got off at this junior college. So I really sort of followed him a little bit, but I would go and study at this college, and I would sort of hunt him down, and then I would find a seat it was kind of like a 3-story library, so they had study nooks everywhere. So I'd figure out where his study nook was, and I would plant myself where I could just sort of watch him, really. It sounds like I was what do you call those people, Buzz? Anyway, I did that for probably 2 or 3 months. And one night I was coming home around 8:30 or so on the bus, and lo and behold, he was on the bus. And when I got off, he got off. And I didn't really realize it. It was only maybe half a block from the bus stop to our house until I was almost at the gate of our yard. And there he was. And anyway, it was sort of fairy tale-ish for me. I had never even talked to him. His name was Alan Johnson, Jonsson. I looked him up on the computer, I don't know, a year or so ago, and he's dead now. But at any rate, he gave me this great big tongue and mouth kiss, and I was just like, thought I was in a big dream. I thought the kiss was disgusting, but other than that, I was just floored. We were moving at that time, we were moving back to Edmonton. Dad had got transferred again. So I told him that we were leaving, and he said, well, we'll just keep in touch by mail and that sort of thing. And so when we moved back to Edmonton, Alan and I wrote for several years because I was like 14 then. And when I went into the nursing program at the university, I was just had turned 18. And he had sent me his college pin and asked me if I would wait for him and tell guys that wanted to take me out that I was pinned to somebody else. So for the first year in college, I really didn't date anybody much. Bruce was still sort of in my life from high school. We were an on and off couple, but nothing serious. And until, when I was maybe in the last part of my second year of college, going into my final year, Bruce had asked me if I would marry him. And I said, I'm not going to marry you until you have a steady job, because I wanted a family and I wanted a home of my own. And I was willing to work, but I expected him to be the breadwinner so I could stay home with the kids at least part-time. And he did give me a diamond, a very small diamond, which I wore for about 3 months and gave it back to him because by then he had gone through another 2 or 3 jobs. Just didn't seem to get an interest in anything. And anyway, I graduated from college the final year. Before I graduated, in the fall, we had just gone into our senior year, I got a letter from Alan saying that he was getting married that weekend. And to a gal, I think she was a fellow teacher, education major, that he had met at the Carleton University, and he apologized and wished me well, and I sent back his pin and wished him well, and that was the end of that. I did have this other young guy in my life for a summer. I don't know, I was in Ottawa, so I learned to kiss from Abby. He taught me how to kiss. And that's all we had in our relationship. I liked him as a friend. He was a really good guy. But he was quite a bit older than I was at the time. I think he was like, 19 or so, and I was like 15. At that age, that was quite a difference. Anyway, it was nothing serious, but he was in my life as well. And then when I got to Edmonton, like I say, I met Bruce in high school, and we were on and off till I left. After my father was killed, I left and went to Seattle, and I didn't see Bruce once after that. When he met me at the airport, I had flown into Edmonton to see my mother, and he picked me up there, and he told me then he wanted to marry me, and he wanted me to move back to Edmonton. And I said, no. He still was not keeping a job more than 6 months. And, I gave him my spiel about, I want a home, I want kids. And if you want to be my husband, you have to have steady work. Anyway, so that took me into Seattle when my mother wanted to marry me. And I had about kids, brief relationship with Peter Chen was his name, when he was to see my getting his PhD in aeronautical engineering. My spiel about I met him taking a night class in Seattle. I was taking a night class in nutrition towards my BSN. And I also had him as a patient. I met brief relationship with Peter in Seattle. Some surgery, and I just happened to take care of him. That's how I met him. And I also had him, and he tracked me down to the university with the class. We dated for probably on and off for probably 4 months. And I also became very serious to the university. And night class. He and his family were refugees from China. Just happened to take the war, and he tracked really down smart guy, really a nice night guy with a lot of integrity. I really and I admired him and liked him a lot, but I wasn't in love with him. And so he wanted to plan a wedding and all this kind of thing. So I finally just had to break up with him. And I know I really hurt him, and that bothers me to this day, because he was a very kind and compassionate man. I remember he took me to their home, and his mother fixed me. It was like a chicken broth soup, but it was for breakfast, and there was a raw egg in it, and I just had the worst time trying to eat that and not offend her. She did not even speak much English at the time. But anyway, that was Peter. And let's see, had lots of sort of male friends, both from Edmonton that I met in my nursing career, and Seattle people. There was kind of a group of us that would go out and have a beer and, all very casual stuff, nothing romantic. And my roommate, Karen, was getting married and going to move out of our apartment in Seattle. And the gal that was our head nurse, Pat Smith was her name, called me. It was actually my birthday that weekend, and she called and asked if I would go on a blind date with her cousin. And I said, no, I didn't do blind dates. And I had done a couple arranged blind dates like that, and they were always a fiasco. So I said, no, thank you. Well, she called me. The third time she called me, I said, okay, gee, I'll go out for dinner, but that's all I'm doing. So it was actually September 9th, my birthday, and this guy came and picked me up, and my first initial thought when he came to the door was, oh, shoot, he's short. I liked tall guys at that time. And anyway, seemed very nice. His name was Lynn Smith, and he was her cousin, and he was living in Salt Lake City and working as an insurance adjuster. And we went out to the Canlis, which is and was a very fancy restaurant in Seattle. I had never been there. And we had a really pleasant dinner, and they had dancing. They had live music, and we danced and had a good time. And he put the move on me when we were dancing, and I stopped dancing with him, told him he needed to stop that or I was just going to go home, and that no guy had gone to bed with me yet, and I wasn't ready to do that. So if that was his intent, he was going to be very disappointed. So I put my cards on the table, and he accepted that. And on the way home, he started telling me how special a girl I was and all that nonsense that guys do. And would I see him the next day? He was leaving to go back to Salt Lake City, I think on Monday. And this was Saturday night that we went out. And so I had to work on Sunday, but we met after I got off at 11:30 or something at night. And, just kissed and talked about our lives and that kind of thing. And he said he was 26 at the time, and I had just turned 24, 23. And he told me that I was the kind of girl he was looking for to marry. And from there, we corresponded. And I flew out at Thanksgiving and saw him and met his parents. And, we got married that February 19th, 1966. And it was the stupidest thing I'd ever done. We really didn't know each other. And I think I was marrying my dream of having a home of my own and children and just a family. And he seemed so much more mature. I was dating a guy that was on the football team for the University of Washington, who was a really nice guy, but I was beyond the things that he was interested in, and I found him very immature. So I found Lynn mature, working, stable job, yada, yada. I guess he fit into my little dream. Anyway, we were married in February, and I think we had been together not 10 days in our pre-marriage life. And that was a mistake. But I have 2 wonderful daughters from that marriage. And we were married not even 2 weeks, and the doorbell rang. I hadn't started work at the University of Utah yet. And this woman appeared, and she was crying hysterically, and I invited her in, and she told me that she had heard Lynn had married me, and she was counting on him marrying her. They had been going together for 2 years, and she told me all about their intimate sex life and some very distressing things for me, and left. And about half an hour later, Lynn came barreling into the apartment, and I was really kind of in shock. I didn't know what to do. I had absolutely no money because I paid for the wedding, and I didn't know anybody in Salt Lake other than him, and I felt really pretty helpless in the fact that I had gone through Catholicism teaching. I had just 2 weeks before promised to marry this guy and stay with him all my life, and I felt like I had made a commitment to God and to myself, and I had to do something not to just drop out of this. anyway, that was a very big disappointment and certainly was a red alert for me what my marriage might be like.
So, when and where and how did you meet Buzz?
We had just moved into a new house in Salt Lake. It was 1972. We had two little girls, Lynn and I, Janine and Kelsey. And Kelsey was a baby. She was not quite 2 yet. And Janine was 4. And Lynn talked about moving to Jackson Hole and setting up his own business. He talked about it over and over again. And I finally said to him one year, I'm willing to move to Jackson. We had gone to Jackson for long weekends, and that was kind of our vacation spot. I said, but I don't want to talk to you about it again. I want you to do something about it. And we had bought this house. We had lived in it for not quite a year, maybe a year. And so I sort of put my foot down, either, sit on the potty or get off it. And so he talked to the company and gave his notice, and I called the hospital in Jackson and got a job, and we moved to Jackson in 1973. We had a really tiny apartment. We had no furniture. The new house we had sort of built-in furniture. So Lynn and I had a bed, but the girls didn't have any. Their bunks were built into the home. And so we really had no couch, because the couch was built into the house too. So we moved with very little to Jackson. And I worked nights and anything else they had, because I couldn't find a babysitter for the kids, and there was only a night position open. And his company called him the second week we were in Jackson and offered to place him there in a paid position. And so he did that for almost a year, and then the Bank of Jackson Hole, Felix Buckenroth, invited him to join the bank and run his insurance company, which he did. And after a year of trying to juggle 2 kids with no babysitter, I heard a new family practice fellow was coming to town and interviewing possible nurses. And I knew that job would work for me, because the kids could then go to a daycare center that had just opened, and I wouldn't have to work nights anymore, which were just killing me. So I did interview, and this gentleman, Bill Hurst, told me that the cardiologist that had arrived at the Jackson Hospital the year before had threatened him if he tried to take me out of the hospital. She thought that I was pretty smart and did not want me to leave taking care of her patients. But when he asked me, well, if I don't hire you, what will you do? I said, well, I'll wait for the next new person to come to town and apply for a job with them. I can't work hospital shifts anymore with my 2 little kids. So he hired me, and I worked with him for 5 years. And he taught me a lot. And I think we were a good team, built up a very busy practice. And I had heard that this fellow, Dr. Ely, had moved there as an OBGYN from Michigan. And I never saw him because, again, I was working in an office. I went to the hospital to pick up labs and paperwork and things, but I didn't spend any time really in the hospital, so I never saw him. Then one day, a friend of mine, Pat Vruck, she worked in the nursing home in the hospital, invited me to a Valentine's party at their office. And the word out about Buzz Ely was that he was really a fine physician, very good, very smart, very good surgeon, and his patients really liked him. So I was anxious to meet him. And that's where I first met Buzz. No, that's where I thought was the first time I met Buzz. But he reminds me that one day I went into Lynn's office to see him, and he was sitting on the couch waiting to see Lynn about his malpractice insurance. And I came in, and Linda Homer, Lynn's number one secretary, introduced me to this man. And this was Buzz Ely, and I welcomed him to town, told him, a little bit about the town and the hospital, and just gave him a warm welcome. I remember it, but it wasn't anything that startled me or really, settled in my mind as really very important. Until I met him again at this Valentine's party. And I have to admit, I was really attracted to him.
What has your relationship been like with him?
We started playing golf together as couples, Pat and Bob Vruck, and Lynn and I, and Nancy and Buzz. And they were evening, after work type golf. And Buzz and I became friends. We played on the same foursome so many times, which sometimes I'll admit I arranged that we would. But I found myself thinking about him more and more and more, and we would have coffee together at the hospital. And we developed quite a friendship. And then one day I was at the hospital doing some work on an education committee that I belonged on. And he was there dictating charts. And he said, "How about a picnic lunch today?" And I said, "Sure." And it just happened Lynn was in Denver, I think, on business. And the kids were at a camp, a school camp. And so I was pretty free to go on this picnic. So I went to the grocery store and got some chicken and fruit and picnic things and met him at the hospital. And we got in his Suburban, and he drove and drove and drove and drove up the mountain, and till we finally got to an area. And we had talked about our attraction to each other, and at one point said that we were just not going to see each other again, even at the hospital. And, I think we were both struggling with that. What do you do with this attraction when you've got a spouse and kids at home? And it was all kind of huge to me. At any rate, we kissed, we talked, and I told him that I had fallen in love with him. My marriage with Lynn was pretty empty for me. I was keeping the promises that I made, but I didn't feel any support or any real love from him at all. I had had surgery in 1979, and I couldn't drive, and he went off on a business trip because he told me that he'd get a free dinner of lamb chops and a great bottle of wine, and I had to figure out how to get to Salt Lake City for surgery myself. So I certainly didn't feel very important in life to him, and I wanted to feel important to the man that I was sharing my life with. So after our picnic, we met another evening after I worked 3 to 11 at the hospital. I was, after my surgery, I went back to the hospital to work. And Buzz pronounced that he thought he was falling in love with me too. And anyway, it was getting very disturbing to me because I'm an honest, upfront person, and this didn't feel good. we certainly, all we did was hug each other and kiss. We didn't do anything else. And I think a couple of days later, I was at the hospital and somebody told me, "Did you hear that Buzz Ely and his wife are getting a divorce?" Well, I about fainted at that because I knew then that everything would be out in the open probably. So we decided that I would move out. I talked to Sandy Z, who agreed to be my attorney, and he said, Lynn was away at business still, and he said, "You should move out while he's out of the house. You never know what an irate husband will do." So there we were, moving some of the old furniture from down the basement out into this apartment. There wasn't much choice of apartments for sure. And our life together started just like that.
How would you describe Buzz?
I sensed Buzz was a very sensual man. He was good looking in a very, like I say, sensual way that really was attractive to me. He appeared very sincere, zany sense of humor, but both of us were trying very hard to be kind to the spouses that we were leaving. And I appreciated that too. He didn't hustle me into bed, and actually his nurse, Pat, who was my friend, told me that he just wanted another notch on his belt. So I did put that on the table and told him I wasn't going to be a notch on your belt. That surprised him, I think. But we had similar values, and we could talk about everything and anything. And there were so many things that I talked to him about that I really should have been talking to Lynn, my husband. But Lynn wasn't interested really in me. I didn't feel, and he wasn't interested in how I felt about anything, everything. And I felt like Buzz was interested in who I was and what I wanted out of life. And it sounds corny, but I think every woman wants to feel like her husband thinks that she's the most important thing in his life. And I remember after Lynn and I got married, we hadn't been married a year, and I said, "You know, you never tell me you love me. I mean, I would like to hear that." And he said, "I married you, didn't I?" That was the answer. So along the 15 years in my marriage, there were things that whatever love I felt for Lynn would evaporate. And the last straw was the Christmas before I left, and his mother was there for Christmas, and it was Christmas Eve, and he never called. He never told me he wasn't coming home. He just didn't come home. And on Christmas Eve, we had this little ritual that we would all choose one or two special foods that we really liked, but they were special, and have them on Christmas Eve, and then go to Mass. And then the kids would come home and go to bed and wait for Santa Claus. Well, Christmas Mass was at 11, and I had not heard anything from Lynn. He could have been dead in a ditch. I didn't know where he was, what he was doing, who he was with. He just simply wasn't there. So I put this dinner together, which wasn't much, and I was furious with him. I mean, in my family, Christmas was such an important thing, and it was a family thing to celebrate together. And then here I had his mother to entertain too. Anyway, packed everybody in the car to go to Mass at 11. And as I'm pulling into the church, there was Lynn sitting out on a side street, beckoning me over to the car. So I sent Lillian and the girls into the church and went to the car, and there was Lynn. He was drunk, and he said, I ate something bad at the Sojourner, and I've been sick. And I confronted him and said, that's such bullshit. You're drunk. And where have you been? He told me he was out entertaining 5 or 6 of his good friends. And I said, do you ever think to entertain your wife and your children? I was, to this day, when I think of it, I just get furious inside that he had so little regard for me and Janine and Kelsey. And he wanted to be the frat boy with his frat brothers, the big shot, buying them lunch and drinks all around. And they all got drunk at the Sojourner. And one of my friend's husband was part of that group. And she said, I told him if he ever did that again, I would divorce him. And I just felt drained of any positive feelings for this man that I'd just spent 15 years with. That was my beginning down the road to Buzz.
What was your wedding day like with Buzz? And do you have any strong memories from that day?
Oh, yeah. That's a question and a half for sure. The summer, August before, we had gone to Yachats, Oregon. Buzz and I were sharing a house, a log house that he had found. And we took the kids to the Oregon coast. And he sort of proposed in his own way and wanted to get married. Well, my divorce wasn't going to be final. Actually, it was final on my birthday that year. It was such a wonderful birthday gift for me. But when he sort of asked me, he said he wanted to get married as soon as the divorces were final. And his wasn't final either. So when we got back from Oregon, again, we were living together. And as the time sort of tweaked by, we decided to get married. And I wanted to get married in September. In the fall, no. Buzz wanted to get married. I think his divorce was final 1st of October or something like that. And he wanted to get married. He picked the date, December 18th. Well, a week before Christmas is a hell of a time to have to plan a wedding and get married, really. So I found a dress, and we talked to the minister of the Baptist church to marry us on December 18th. We sent out invitations to all of our friends that it was just a Christmas party. Come to our Christmas party on December 18th. And I told my best friend, Ruth, what was going on and would she manage the food, most of which I had prepared probably half of it, and the other half was coming from a caterer. But I needed somebody at the house while we were getting married. So in the morning of the wedding, we woke up, and I shared a bed with Kelsey up in the loft of this house. And Buzz had the master, and Janine was in the guest bedroom. And he came to me, and Buzz came to me and said, "Come on, get up. It's our wedding day." And I said, I remember it vividly saying, "I have a really bad headache," which would be enough to discourage most guys, but not Buzz. He got the girls out of bed and took them they were getting their hair done and all kinds of festivities. And I remember, I don't know, I was down in the kitchen having coffee or something, and he came up to me and put his arms around me and very gently said, "Everything is going to be fine." And I just remembered that, wonderful, calm voice about we love each other, the kids will be okay, we'll be okay, and thinking, okay, I can do this. Because frankly, I felt like I never wanted to get married again. I felt when I was married to Lynn that I was like a possession. He owned me, and I hated that feeling. When I moved out and I was on my own, even though money was really scarce, I only answered to myself, and I liked that feeling. And expressed that to Buzz, and he said, "Oh, I'll never own you. You know, if whatever you want to do will be good." And so we went off to get married, and Katie Tapp, I think was her name. She was a young girl, like 18. She had been killed during the night in a real freak one-car accident. And so the minister needed an extra hour he had to do her funeral, I guess, and then our wedding after that. And he said he needed an hour break to regroup because obviously it was a very sad funeral. So we did regroup. I don't know, drove around. We had the girls in the car, and Buzz's kids were going to meet us at the church. So when it was 3 o'clock instead of 2 o'clock, we got to the church, and I had a silk bouquet, I remember, of pink roses. And all the kids were kind of dressed up. And I remember them all standing, Anne with her husband, I think they were married then, all up at the altar part. And I walked down the aisle myself to Buzz, and I cried the whole way down the aisle. And I wasn't sad. It wasn't sad tears. It was really, I can't believe this is happening. And I really love this man, and that we're really going to be a Mr. and Mrs. and all those things were going through my brain walking down the aisle. And so I said my vows and cried through every one. And Buzz said his vows, and there we were, Mr. and Mrs. And so we all got in the car to go back to the log house we were sharing, all the kids. We got back, and the house was full of people that had all arrived, and they knew when they arrived and saw the wedding cake on the dining room table that we had gotten married. And it was very festive and happy. And I don't know if I'd ever been that happy in my life. It felt all right, and I felt the future was going to be fine. Buzz and I could work hard and make up for, the possessions that we had lost in the divorce. And we had each other, and we'd do good for the kids. And it was a wonderful, wonderful day. And we went to a little cabin, Signal Mountain Lodge, for our honeymoon. And Buzz had arranged that after the honeymoon, we were going to drive up to Edmonton. Now remember, this is December, and Edmonton is winter country. Anyway, I didn't think anything of that either. We got to Signal Mountain Lodge, and there was about 4 feet of snow, and Buzz had brought enough groceries to last a week. And we trudged through all this snow, carrying in the groceries and our belongings. And he broiled 2 steaks, and we had this wonderful dinner and started our life together. The next morning, I wanted to do some cross-country skiing, so we got up and got dressed and went outside, and the other side of the cabin was totally shoveled out by some wonderful person. We didn't know that, and in the dark, getting to the cabin, we trudged through all that snow. We laughed about that. That was a crazy way to start out life together, but it's been a wonderful life, just a wonderful life. Buzz was the husband that I dreamed about when I was young. And I think our deep friendship with each other, we like each other, we respect each other, we have the really common values that we believe in, has, gotten us through some of the few thin times that we've had in our marriage. And we're at such a good place. It's been a great life with him.
Once in your life, you find her, someone who turns your heart around, and next thing you know, you're closing down the town. Wake up and it's still with you, even though you left your way across town, wondering to yourself, hey, what have I found? When you get caught between the moon and New York City, I know it's crazy, but it's true. If you get caught between the moon and New York City, best that you can do, best that you can do is fall in love. Arthur, he does as he pleases. All of his life, his master's toys, and deep in his heart, he's just a boy. Living his life one day at a time, he's showing himself a pretty good time. He's laughing about the way they want him to be. When you get caught between the moon and New York City, I know it's crazy, but it's true. If you get caught between the moon and New York City, best that you can do, best that you can do, best that you can do is fall in love.
Okay, now we're going to start talking about your career or your hobbies. Why did you choose the college that you went to?
I chose the University of Alberta, the nursing program there, because it had a prestigious name and it was in my hometown, so it would be easy to certainly go there and plus see my family too. My second choice was the Winnipeg General Hospital that had a program that was good as well. I think I was one of the lucky ones that knew at a very young age, maybe 5, that I wanted to be a nurse, and it just was a natural thing for me. When I was 17 and just graduating from, I was in my senior year of high school, I worked that summer as a nurse's aide at the University of Alberta. I worked in the military wing where we had all our veterans there. It was huge. It was like 40 patients in one big room. And I did all the scut work for the nurses. But it was a good introduction into what nursing was really going to be for me. And when I applied, I think I mentioned this in another question, but when I applied, I got turned down by the board because when I filled out my application under "Have you ever had seizures?" I had to put yes, because I'd had 5 seizures, even though at that point I hadn't had one for 4 years on medication. And so I went to my neurologist and said, now what do I do? And frankly, I was totally disappointed that a board of a college of nursing would turn down somebody who wanted to be a nurse because they had history of seizures. It's like my neurologist would use me as a high school student to talk to younger kids that had developed seizures just like I had, and talk to them about how you can lead a pretty normal life if you take your medication regularly, yada, yada. In those days, I think I've mentioned in an earlier recording too, I didn't have a bike. Wasn't allowed swim lessons and all the natural sports type things that young kids do. And it was a protection thing for me, but it was also very isolating. So when the board turned me down, I told my neurologist, he asked me, well, then now what are you going to do? And I said, well, I'm going to apply to the Winnipeg General program, and I'm not going to tell them I had seizures. I haven't had one for, at that point, it was 4 years, and I'm just not going to tell them. And so he then went to the Board of Regents and said, look, let this young girl in, and if she has seizures, I'll be responsible for her. And I'll take the responsibility that she will take her medication. So that's how I got into the University of Alberta. I never did have a seizure. And in my last year, when I knew I wanted to travel outside of Edmonton with my nursing degree, that he just took me off, cold turkey took me off 2 neural medications for seizures. I never noticed any difference. And I picked up my medication every month, so no one in administration knew that I had stopped my medication. And that's how I graduated from the University of Alberta.
What were your college days like?
The nursing college days were long. In lieu of paying tuition, the nursing students worked, and we truly did work. We went to class, and say we had classes in the morning, then we either worked nights or 3 to 11, but we did work. Even in our first year, we were taking care of patients and learning practically what we learned in class, how to do it. It was a good program, and the program really did graduate a good nurse at the end of 3 full years as far as knowledge base. We worked in the burn unit. We worked in, it wasn't, I don't like the word experimental, but it was new. The physician that was in charge of the chest program at the University of Alberta had just learned CPR, and we didn't even know what that was then. If they wanted to resuscitate somebody, they cut the chest open and grabbed the heart with their hand and would squeeze it. But this had just was a new novel way of resuscitating, and he was starting to do open heart surgery at the University of Alberta. And as a student, I did excel at the practicality of nursing, taking care of patients. My grades, my test grades, were pretty average, but I don't know whether it was a reputation, but when they grade you at the end of a tour of a unit, I had always had very good grades in the practical. And so he asked me if I would like to work on that floor to take care of patients. Now, they were in the little ICU, which had 3 beds, and a physician that was in there 99% of the time. When they came out, they went onto this chest floor, and I ran that chest floor during nights for 6 weeks, and was in charge on a 3 to 11 shift. I remember going into checking on patients before I left at 11:30 or 11 to give report, and found this gentleman dead in the bathroom. And that wasn't, our mortality rate was pretty high at that time. A lot of the surgery they were doing on valve replacements was pretty precarious and new to everybody. I also worked independently in the burn unit, which I absolutely hated. That was one rotation I hated, and they kept putting me there when they were short-staffed because I supposedly did so well there. But I used to have nightmares all the time about that unit, and I still remember patients that I took care of that were just pathetic. Burns are just, I think, the worst. Anyway, I like just chest surgery, and I like taking care of surgical patients too, because most of them got better every day. You could see an end to their illnesses, unlike the medical floors. So when I graduated, I worked on I remember the name of it was Station 55, and it was a big general surgery post-op floor, and there were probably 35 or 40 patients on that floor. It was very busy. So as students, we got 1 day off during the week, and we got paid. After the first 6 months, we got paid $12 a month, which was supposed to pay for your toothpaste and shampoo and laundry soap and all that sort of thing. And it did, but it didn't pay for anything extra, I can tell you. On my 1 day off, I would take the bus home to my mom and dad's house and have dinner with them. And sometimes I brought classmates along. They all loved drinking beer with my dad in his garage. Eileen Gillis, which was one of my closest friends, taught my dad the Mule Skinner blues, and he fed her beer. They were quite a duo out in that garage. Like I say, there wasn't really any extra time. We had a little coffee shop diner on the grounds of the university, and we would go there for a hamburger once we got our $12 for that month, or to a corner. There was a little pub there. We would have a beer even though we were underage. But there wasn't a lot of time or energy after working and going to class, but that's how we could get an education, and it didn't cost our parents anything other than some little extra money when we changed uniforms and needed new shoes or something like that. So it was a busy time. I enjoyed it. I loved the practical part, which is probably why I did well, and had arrived at the fact that I wanted to work either in the emergency room, and they didn't take new grads, or the surgical area, because they were doing so much new work. And I ended up on the surgical area.
So you mentioned that you knew you wanted to be a nurse at a young age. Are there any other things that came to light as to why you chose this area to study?
Well, in those years, not many women worked outside the home, and my mother certainly didn't. But the choices were limited, unlike now where you could do anything you wanted to be. There was like nursing, secretarial, teaching. There just wasn't really the choice. But like I say, even at a very young age, 4 or 5, for Christmas I got a little nursing kit, and I just knew that's what I wanted to do. I can't explain it. It was, just an inner thing. And I nursed actively until I was 61, and I never, ever felt that I wanted a different career. The one wonderful thing about nursing is that you can be a nurse and never see a patient, or you can be a nurse and be up to your ears in sick people all day long. And I liked the second. I liked having the sickest patient in the intensive care unit or in the emergency room. Those were the 2 areas I really liked and still like. And I just got satisfaction out of that, and out of being able to figure out what was happening with a very sick patient to call the doctor and say, I need you to come in because of A, B, C, or D. And I was able to tune out the trivia and be able to zone in on that sort of priority of whatever the illness was. And I've never looked back. I've enjoyed all those years of taking care of sick people. And I feel so blessed that I had that inner calling, because I never hated going to work. Every day was different, and every day was a challenge, no matter what kind of nursing I was doing then.
So tell us about your very first job, and maybe give us a short summary of how your career evolved and what other jobs you held throughout the course of your nursing career.
Well, my first job was on this very busy surgical floor, and it was very busy. And I started working nights, and like most new grads, get the worst shifts. But I worked there a year. My father had asked me to come back and live at home for a year, and I needed to do that to save some money to go anywhere else.
Where was
And
that at?
that was at the University of Alberta, is my home hospital. The psych department had requested that I work there as a grad. I did. Again, I got a very good report from doing my student nursing there, and I just couldn't. Psych was just not my field. I wanted physically really ill patients, and so that's the floor I worked on. At the end of a year, 2 friends and myself quit our jobs and drove to California for a week. We had applied at the University of British Columbia Hospital in Vancouver, BC. And I just wanted to get out on my own. My older sister had eloped right after she graduated from nursing. And my father always felt it was very important, having 3 girls, that all 3 of us had an education, a way to earn money for our own lives, and if we became single mothers, which ironically 2 out of the 3 of us did, we would be able to support the children and ourselves. The floor I worked on at UBC was a terminally ill floor. Again, being a newcomer to the University of British Columbia Hospital, I got whatever was open. And I worked 3 to 11 shift, and there was probably 30 beds. And for a patient to get on to this floor, they had to have a terminal diagnosis and have management a problem for them. There was a Swedish resident who ran this floor, and our job was to keep these people comfortable regardless of how much medication they needed. And it was a very, very sad place. I still remember one patient that I had. She was a young woman in her early 30s that had 3 children and a husband, and she was dying of ovarian cancer. And I still remember this evening, her husband came to see her, and he was crying, and she was mean to him. She was arguing kind of with him and saying some angry things. So when he left, I asked her if everything was okay, and was there, did she want to talk about what she was angry about? And she said, my husband's crying because I'm dying, and he says, we have 3 children, and what are we all going to do without you? And she said, nobody thinks, they think, oh, I'm losing you. But, I'm losing everybody. Everyone I love, I'm losing. And she thought he was being selfish, worrying about himself. And I just will never forget her. Every time I've taken care of a dying patient from that moment, I remembered her saying, I am losing everyone that I love, and tried to be, supportive and loving towards that person, and supportive of them as well. From that, because I didn't have my BSN degree, when I graduated, if you wanted to work in a hospital, you took your 3-year degree, and that's what you did. People that had their BSNs either taught nursing or they were public health nurses, and I didn't want to do either one. So I stayed with hospital nursing. My father was killed when I was at UBC, and I went home to help my mother for a year, which turned out to be more like a year and a half. And then I immigrated down into Seattle with a classmate, Ann George, and we were roommates together. We had jobs at the University of Washington. And again, my job was in a little tiny 3-bed intensive care unit that did open hearts. And again, they were still very new and experimental in a lot of ways, and our death rate was pretty high. I learned a lot, and I stayed there for almost 3 years, and I met my first husband, Lynn Smith, who was a cousin of the gal that was my head nurse. I had just received a promotion. They had decided that they wanted a nurse, 2 of us, and they interviewed, I think it was 9 people. Another gal that I worked with and myself got the jobs. What they wanted was a nurse that was between the physicians and the patients and the families, keeping the families informed, and it was more of a PR communication thing because our death rate was so high. I did that job just for 6 months and left to get married. I did work then at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, and I worked there for almost 8 years in the emergency room. The last year, because my shift was 3 to 11 again for those years, I asked to be transferred to a day job, and I worked 1 year in the operating room at that time, and we left to live in Jackson, Wyoming. And I applied for a job there, because it was a small hospital compared to the university. It was a 40-bed hospital, and most of it was general medicine and surgery. But there was an emergency room, and they did OB, and it's like you had to do a little bit of everything because we were spread pretty thin in this small town, having enough nurses. After 4 months of working nights in a new town that didn't have good daycare, I left that and worked for a family practice doctor, Bill Hurst. He moved to town from Texas, and I helped set up his practice and worked there for 5 years. And the hours were just more suitable for Janine and Kelsey, who were very young. I helped set up a daycare there, and to this day, it's the main daycare for Jackson. I'm very proud of that. Then Lynn and I got a divorce, and I went back to the hospital to work. And I worked in the main part of the hospital and ran med-surg unit, and then went to the intensive care unit and ran that until my second husband, Buzz Ely, and I left to live in Anacortes, Washington. And when I moved here, they hired me to be the director of nursing, and nursing was in a huge mess. They had had a walkout of nurses protesting management. And so for the first 2 years, we had a fair number of registry because it was very difficult to hire in a area that had two other hospitals, and our hospital had a bad reputation for how nurses were treated. Anyway, at my third year as director, I finally had enough nurses that would come and work there and that believed that the management would support them. And after, 7.5 years, 8 years, Buzz retired from OB here, and we went to work for the Navy, the two of us. I worked in the emergency room, and he worked managing OB clinics for the Navy. And after that, when we came back, our hospital rehired me. They had been buying clinics in the interim that I was with the Navy, and they hired me to be the clinical interface between the clinics and the hospital. It wasn't a happy job because the employees of the hospital really resented the clinics. Because we hired physicians and bought their practices, there was very little money left over for hospital things, and they thought that was really unfair. So that was a struggle. I retired from that job in 2001 and volunteered in the cancer clinic, which was my last project before I left the clinical interface work. I have to add, when we were still in Salt Lake, I had wanted to go back and get my degree. Nursing had changed from the time in 1962 when I graduated, that management jobs and just climbing any ladder, you really needed your BSN degree. But unfortunately, my husband at the time, Lynn, would not support that. He didn't want the extra responsibility, even though I had worked and put him through school. He denied me going back. He didn't want to be, he wanted more free time for himself. And obviously, if I was in school, I would have to go to Pocatello or Salt Lake City, somewhere else. There was no degree program out of Jackson. So that was a very big piece of unfinished business for me. And I'm sorry I never was able to complete that. In spite of that, I was able to run the hospital really here in Anacortes and keep up with all of my peers from the surrounding Washington hospitals that all had master's degrees. And I'm proud of that. I always will feel badly that I never was able to go back and finish my degree and then get a master's, because I always wanted to do that. My daughter Kelsey is living that for me. She went back to school. She graduated with a BSN and then went back to school and got her master's, and I'm just so proud of her because she was able to do that.
Can you tell us what your most favorite and least favorite job you've ever had were?
Well, let's see. My least favorite job, I think, was in Jackson when I was asked to take over the operating room. I was already managing the intensive care unit, and the head nurse in the operating room had left rather abruptly, and things were sort of unraveling. I found the egos back in the operating room almost intolerable to deal with. I had a good group of nurses in the intensive care unit, and everybody tried to help everybody. And if you were really short and you called one of them and said, "Could you come in for a couple of hours?" 9 times out of 10 they would. And this was a group in the operating room that I could see from the numbers that the orthopedic surgeons, that was their big complaint, is the orthopedic surgeons wanted to do surgery that was off hours and on Saturdays or Sundays, and they didn't want to come in. They didn't consider those emergencies for some reason. And sitting down with one nurse that was very vocal. We had a long talk, and I finally said, when you can prove to people that the work is here and that the physicians need to do it after hours or on weekends, I just was having trouble understanding what all the reluctance is. You're getting paid overtime to come in and do this job, and that's why you're on call. And the answer I got was, well, we don't consider those emergencies. They should be doing those Monday through Friday. I said, Monday through Friday is their office days, and they have a surgery day assigned to them. But other than that, they have patients in their office. Do you just want to leave those patients waiting for 2 or 3 hours while they, fix something orthopedically? And she said, well, that's what I signed up for. And I said, well, your job has changed here. 3 years ago when you came, there wasn't all these orthopods and yada, yada. We talked it out, and it was so selfish, her reasoning, that, I couldn't get through to her. And I never forgot that conversation about how skewed everything had become back in the operating room. I didn't know the head nurse that well. She had been there a very long time, and I thought she was a great gal, but she obviously acquiesced to these me type things. And I wasn't very popular when I said, this is where the work is. If you want to work in the operating room and you want to take call, you have to come in for this work. And it's slowly resolved, I think, because first of all, the administrator that had asked me to take this on stood solidly behind me. And of course, so did the orthopods, because that was life for them. They couldn't just leave an office full of people and go do surgery at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. But I also found that hospital nurses, whether it be on the med-surg unit or in the operating room, have no clue about office medicine and how it works and how disruptive and difficult it becomes when something like a 2 or 3 hour surgery is thrown into your day. But that was my least favorite because it was pretty negative, even though I only did it for 6 months when they hired someone to take over. But it opened my eyes, first of all, to how well I thought the ICU was working, and just the personalities in the operating room. They really were, they thought they were special, and that no other department was as needed as their department was. And what a come down it must have been for them to have me come in and not recognize that, because I don't believe that. I don't believe the intensive care unit was super special or OB or anything else. Any nurse taking care of a patient is just as valuable as a specialty nurse in some other department. Anyway, that was my most unfavorite. I certainly, in the operating room, you don't really have patient contact. You do while they're awake and before you've put them to sleep, but that's a very brief time. And I really liked the contact of a patient and the nurse contact. And you certainly didn't have much of that back there. I think my favorite job, I've had a couple of real favorite jobs, but one of my most favorite was working for Rich Sugden. I worked there as the manager of the office as well as his nurse. And I flew for the air ambulance that he was in charge of in the evenings, on weekends, or whenever I was able to. I liked the attitude that Rich had as far as trusting me and my knowledge and my training. He one day proposed to me that he would send me to PA school if I would come back and work for him as a PA. And at the time, I wasn't divorced yet, and I had 2 children. I didn't know how I was going to do that, except I would have to move them probably to Pocatello. That was the closest PA school. But I really know that I would have loved that, and it would have been a way to get that extra training that I had tried to get by going back to school. And I know I would have been good at that. And Rich thought so too. And I always remember that. That was a lot of trust and that he put into me. But that was, it was a very varied job, and I really liked it. I also liked working just as a staff nurse in ICU and just taking care of patients. But I think my most favorite job was the emergency room 3 to 11 job I had at the University of Utah. Tons of responsibility and decision making, but it was rewarding, and it was, I just learned a ton every single shift I worked.
When you look back at your career, do you have any regrets?
I have a couple of regrets, I think. I regret that I was never able to go back and finish the education that I wanted. But to do that, like I watched Kelsey go through and get her master's degree while she was working and had a home to run and 2 kids. But she was able to do that because she had a husband that really supported what she wanted to do and would help and do anything to allow her that study time and things like that. And I really didn't have that. But if I'd been a little bit more courageous, I would have taken Rich Sugden up on his offer to put me through PA school, because it would have given me that step up, if you want. Hard to climb a ladder if you don't have the credentials, even though I was able to do it here in Anacortes. And as Buzz reminds me, that I should feel really good about that, because I was competing. Everybody else in my tier was master's prepared. But there was something inside of you that, knows that you're lacking a credential, whether it really matters or not. I've always felt with education of nurses that if they were critical thinkers and really cared about the patient, I could teach them anything and they could do anything. But in the real world now, you have to have those sort of credentials to move up any ladder. But yes, I regret those 2 things. But I have many other things that I really feel good about.
So why don't you tell us, when you look back on your career, what are you or what were you most proud of?
Well, a couple of things. I am really proud of what I was able to achieve at Island in their nursing. When Phil Sandifer hired me, after Buzz and I moved here, he hired me in November of '87. Nursing was in a mess. They had had a walkout, a near strike the year before of nursing, who felt that they weren't heard by administration and nursing wasn't safe there, and a lot of complaints, I understand. But when I took over, we were probably 40% of our staff was agency staff, because the nurses had left and gone to other hospitals. And it took me 6 months or so to get a handle on what was the problem. And the problem was a previous leader that I had replaced, who was a very dogmatic, unilateral, what I say goes type leader. It did take me that long, 6 months at least, to get nurses to trust me and to realize when I said something, I would follow through with it, and that my office wasn't bugged with recording everybody's conversation so she could fire them later. as far as getting the registry people out, which was super expensive, and the staff resented those salaries that were going out, it just took the community, and I mean the greater community, Mount Vernon, Oak Harbor, and Cedar Woolley, to realize that that leader that they all feared was gone. And I was the new leader, even though they didn't know who I was. I wasn't that past person. So I had to put my name on every ad that went out, so they realized that I was the new director of nursing. And once the word got out that things were different and that the new management listened to them and cared about them and also knew the work that they were doing, that I wasn't totally removed from the care of a patient, things changed. And I was able to fill my empty positions. The physicians were happy. And another year passed. So at the end of 2 years, we were now the hospital that people, nurses, wanted to work at, and my physicians were happy, the patients were happy, and best of all, the nurses were happy.
What were some of the hobbies or volunteer work that you did in or outside of your career that you loved or were proud of? Daycare thing.
In Jackson, I'm really proud of what I was able to put into establishing a good daycare center for children. When I moved there, there was, the babysitter that had 30 children or 20 kids and plunked them down in front of a TV all day. And that isn't what I wanted for my kids, because I worked the 3 to 11 shift. Janine and Kelsey were home with their dad, who was going to school most of those years, and I was there at night and during the day, so they didn't have to go to daycare. And I was appalled at what people call daycare there. So there was a gal there named Sandy Shuptrine, and she was doing daycare in her home, and I met with her, and she believed in teaching these kids. And I mean, she just had the right temperament, but also the right ideas about what daycare was. And so she put me on the board, and she was trying to establish a working board so that further down the road we could, build a building. She wouldn't be able to house the people in her home. And so we had a big fund drive to build this community children's project. And I went to Felix Buckenroth and told him that I wanted to borrow, I think it was $30,000, which is nothing today, but it was a lot way back then, which was probably 1974. And he said, well, what's your collateral? And I said, I don't have any. We have so many children and we've got a waiting list, and that's my collateral. And this community has to have, with mothers having to work because salaries were low and expenses were high in that town, that we really needed a good, safe environment for our kids. Believe it or not, he gave me the money. And so I could go back to the next board meeting and say, we've got the funds to be able to do this. And we did, and Buzz and I were just back there for a few days, and that community children's project is huge. It's got its own building, and it's a real force in the town, and one that working mothers probably are just delighted to have when they move there. I'm very proud of that. When I left paid nursing in 1961, one of the projects that was the last one I put together was a cancer care center, and it was done on a shoestring. So when I retired, I told them I would come back and volunteer doing anything there to help keep that department within budget and make it work. And so I took another nurse who retired about the same time I did, Jerry Strom, and we went right to the cancer center as volunteers. And I did that for, honestly, I've kind of lost count, but maybe 15 years or so. And Jerry, I think, just left this year because of poor health, but I left because a disgruntled nurse reported me to the union and said I was taking work away from union nurses and on. And the director of nursing at the time was absolutely not versed in the rules and regs for registered nurses. And so I had really no support and had to leave that position. I went from that position to community education and really am still there. We're working our way through COVID, but hopefully when COVID's over, we'll be working again, doing the community education projects. What was the other
You started the gala.
Oh, yes. When I went to the cancer clinic, the gal that was in charge of the foundation, the board had just gone, and Buzz was on the board then, had just said they wanted a big fundraiser for the hospital. There was no annual fundraiser. And I knew of someone who had lost her husband at the cancer clinic that was full of energy, and I thought of her. And I matched her together with the head of the foundation and said, put together a big dinner dance. I was thinking of what the Jackson Hospital had in May at Jackson Lake Lodge. And that was the start of the gala. And I don't even remember how many years old it is now, but that must have been 2002 or 3. And I had it when I was working as the director of nursing and assistant administrator, gone to the foundation suggesting this for a fundraiser. And the answer I got is, no, they really didn't want to do that. And so they hadn't done anything. So I was instrumental in getting that put together, and it's raised a lot of money for the hospital. I am proud of that. This year, I organized 5 of us retired registered nurses to vaccinate the community for COVID. And we did, and we had a great time, and I was very proud of the group and what we were able to contribute to this horrible thing, the COVID-19. It is now nearing the end of August, and the 1st of September I will go back for one session to help vaccinate those workers who had refused to get the vaccination early and are facing termination of their job if they don't get it. And I am proud of that and proud of the group.
How about your time on the foundation or the
auxiliary? I did serve on the Island Hospital Foundation. I started as secretary and went to president. We did a big fundraiser for the hospital, which wasn't successful. And I always felt that it wasn't because the administration had hired this big time group out of Seattle. And Anacortes isn't Seattle. You wouldn't communicate to Anacortes people the way you would Seattleites. And there was a lot of ego involved, and ultimately we failed there. But I think failing was the right thing to do at that time. I did restart the hospital auxiliary. I've always felt that every hospital needed an auxiliary. When I was the director of nursing, I counted on those people to do the extras that my nurses didn't have time to do. And they did, and I absolutely loved that group. By the time I retired, the group had dwindled to about 8 or 9 people, and they weren't well. They were elderly. Everybody else had either died or were in nursing homes. And so I was able, Vince called me one day and asked me if I would try to jumpstart the auxiliary. And I just retired from the auxiliary after, 7 years or so, and I feel very good about all I contributed there. I started several new programs that are still successful and doing things that the auxiliary should do. Because of COVID, again, our time in the hospital is not allowed until CDC gives their authorization. I don't know when that will be. COVID is rampant again, so I'm sure it won't be for a while.
Talk about the Rotary Award, too.
Buzz wants to mention these awards that I have received for my volunteer work. I kind of hate to do that because it sounds like bragging, but I did head up putting AEDs in our community, which took 2-3 years, putting them in strategic places. The one we finally got in the gym has saved, I think, 6 lives so far. But I am proud of that. That was a lot of beating up people to convince them that their business needed one. But that was a plus for our community. I did get an award from Kiwanis for my work in the cancer clinic, and I was surprised, and yes, I was proud of my work there, and it was nice to receive that sort of thank you. Both Buzz and I received the Spirit of the Island Award, which is given with the agreement of the foundation and the hospital administration. It can't be for a paid employee. It has to be someone who has done something in their community or their hospital to improve things for the community members. And I was given that, I don't even remember what year now, but several years later when Buzz retired as a commissioner from the hospital after 18, some of them very difficult years. So both of us are on the plaque. There hasn't been anybody else nominated since that time. But yes, I'm proud of both of us actually for the work we have done for our small town hospital.
I didn't know what day it was when you walked into the room. I said hello unnoticed. You said goodbye too soon. Breezing through the clientele, spinning yarns that were so lyrical. I really must confess right here, the attraction was purely physical. I took all those habits of yours that in the beginning were hard to accept. Your fashion sense, beards, lip prints, I put down to experience. The big bosom lady with a Dutch accent who tried to change my point of view. Her ad-lib lines were well rehearsed, but my heart cried out for you. You're in my heart, you're in my soul. My love for you is immeasurable. My respect for you immense. You're ageless, timeless, lace and fineness.
This
your beauty
next group of questions is going to be in regards to some life lessons you've learned and values that you may want future generations to know. What is the most important thing your parents ever taught you?
Well, my father was a serious man. I think my personality is a lot more like his, and Linda is exactly like my mother. Anyway, the one thing that he preached was, integrity. He didn't use that word, but really that's what it was, that at the end of the day, when you brushed your teeth and looked in the mirror, you had to like what you saw. And, they taught us all the normal values, honesty and hard work and thinking of others and those things. But I remember my dad telling me that there were going to be times in my life when I was going to have to make choices. And those choices were going to be difficult ones because the choice might be something that would not benefit me personally, but would be the right thing to do. And he encouraged me to always think through things like that. Is this going to benefit me? Or in benefiting me, is it going to hurt somebody else? And be able to weigh those things and feel good at the end of the day that you did the right thing. And I've thought of that many times in my administrative work when I had to make some difficult choices and decisions. And if it were me that were the employees, what would be the right thing? And that's probably been the most valuable lesson. My mother was a kind of a freewheeler. She loved to play jokes. She loved to have a good time. She hated housework, and she, was really pretty confined when you look at her upbringing. She had, her parents were wealthy at that time, and they were very difficult from the days of being up in the Northlands and up in Labrador and having to ski for groceries and figure out recipes because her mother didn't cook, so her mother didn't pass that little treasure down to her. But all in all, she was very kind and very loving and very loyal. And I always treasured that piece of her the most, really, was her, you got to have some fun in life. Life is too serious. And I think my father's seriousness, because of his work and his upbringing, which was real difficult, they filled the gaps in for each other, I guess. And I appreciated that.
What was your greatest adventure?
Well, probably my greatest adventure, since, I was pretty protected as a kid from doing anything because, again, of my seizures. So it was pretty boring, I think, youth for me. But my greatest adventure really was nursing. And I remember the summer I worked as a nursing aide, trying to get a feel for, was this really what I have put all my deck of cards on the table for this particular career. I realized when I was doing the tasks of a nursing aide, one thing I would never do is demean anybody or demean the staff. I worked with some very prideful nursing students who really thought they were hot stuff and treated me like a piece of trash, only to find that in September I was in the class behind them. But I found, in the working world, the more that you treat your coworkers with respect and compassion when they need it, the better they'll give to you back. And I've tried to use that lesson anytime I was in administration. And even if I was making a decision that people would not agree with, I knew was the right decision overall. But my greatest adventure, if you want to call it the adventures of kids, I guess, was after I graduated that summer. 2 friends and I jumped in a car and went down the California coast and stopped and met lots of people and saw lots of things and came back, and we settled in Vancouver, British Columbia. We didn't know anybody there. We all had jobs, but we didn't know anybody. And I have to say, it wasn't the year I graduated. It was a year later. My father asked me to stay 1 year, which I had to do anyway because I didn't have any money to travel or go anywhere, and I didn't have a car. So it was the year later. But I think that was probably the biggest adventure of my young life. And my father preached to all 3 of us that we should leave home, be on our own, earn our own money, spend our own money, and make our own mistakes and rectify them ourselves. He wanted us to be able to be independent. For some reason, he was afraid we were going to be single mothers, which I think ironically 2 of us were. But that was probably the greatest adventure.
What is the funniest thing that ever happened to you?
Well, when I worked for Dr. Rich Sugden, he was a real prankster, and he loved April Fool's Day. And so we always tried to one-up each other on April Fool's Day. But one of the funniest things, I had just gone to work for him, and we each had a phone at our desks, and the phone call signaled whether it was an outside call or an inside call. And one really busy morning, I got an inside call and picked up the phone, and there was shaving soap all over the phone, and obviously it was all in my hair at the end of picking up the phone with Rich at the other end. And through my years of working for him, there were several other things like that he did. But I think that was one of the funniest, just because I wasn't used to being in that kind of environment. My 5 years with Bill Hearst were all pretty serious, hardworking years. So that was probably one of them. The other one was when I was the assistant administrator of the hospital here. We were having a really busy stretch. It was flu season, and the hospital was full, and it was busy, and I was coming into work a little early to figure out if I had to help clinically or I could do my administrative work. And one of the nurses was saying, June, who was the gal that was in charge of nights, she needs you in room 4. She needs you there as soon as you can get there. Well, I was loaded down with manuals and books because at the time we were putting together a total joint program. And so I took them all home. I think it was for the weekend so I could go through them. So I said, well, I've got to put all these books down. She said, oh, just put them down on the nurse's station. She needs you in room 4. So I rushed in there, and she said, I'm just having trouble with this IV. And the patient was looking up at her IV, and she said, it just won't drip right, and I've done everything I know to do. Can you check it? So I always check at the site first and then go up the tubing to the bottle. And so I'm checked all of that, and it was all fine. I got to the bottle, and there were 2 goldfish in the bottle of fluid, which obviously wasn't going into the patient. And the patient and this night nurse just absolutely guffawed in laughter. They had thought of this up, and June had gone to this patient to say, would she partake in this joke? And they did. And anyway, the night staff never let me live that one down. That's probably the funniest.
What are the most important things in life?
I think by far the most important thing in life is to love and feel that love and to love back and to be free with that love, with your children, with your friends, with the person you're sharing life with. I missed that in my first marriage, and the last 40 years have been so wonderful for me because Buzz shows me every day he loves me, and he really loves me. I can feel it, and I can feel my kids' love, and there's nothing better than for somebody that you do love to just open their arms and hug you and transfer their love from their heart to your heart. It sounds corny, but it is love that gets us through some really hard things in life and gives us the energy and the positiveness to give back to the world. And I think you have to, when you truly are loved and your love bank is full, then you have, just like a bank, you can give it back. You can give that love from your love bank to people around you that need it. And it affects everything and colors everything that you look at and that you do and that you feel, both giving and coming into you. I know that sounds corny, but I believe that.
Did you just say that? What do you wish you could tell your younger self?
I wished I could have told my younger self to lighten up, to not be so serious. I think at age 9, when I developed the seizures, that changed me. I mean, forever, really. I suddenly had a condition, if you would, that was unknown as to what was causing them initially. And suddenly there were so many things that I was not allowed to do. And it made me serious. I think at the time I went to see our family practice physician. His name was Dr. Loudon, and I was probably 10. And I actually made the appointment myself and went in myself and wanted to talk to him about whether or not I should be sterilized and not have any children. Because I had read in the encyclopedias that we had at home that in many countries that was a provision, that if you had grand mal seizures, you couldn't bear children. And I was very distressed about this. So I wished I could have been a little more lighthearted and not taken the world so seriously. Life is short, and I feel that way today, that I still take things seriously. Buzz is very good for me because he's very lighthearted, and he'll say to me, "Oh, don't be so serious, things will be fine." And he's helped me a lot just by being that lighthearted person. It helps me lighten up a little bit. I'm not sure how that would have changed my life, but I certainly might have enjoyed it a little bit more.
How did your values change as you got older?
I'm not sure my values have really changed. Like I said before, my father was a very serious man too, and instilled some serious values in us as we were growing up. You know, honesty, the value of friendship, and how you treat people, loyalty, doing the right thing. And I think I took those values with me into adulthood. In that interim of growing up with seizures, I had some pretty unhappy things happen. I did have a seizure in the gym class one day, and the school nurse, who was an older woman, took me home and berated my mother for my scaring the rest of the girls in gym class. I will never forget that, and I would never, ever want anyone to feel how I felt that day. So I think treating everyone with dignity and respect and kindness, I hope I never do lose those values. I do think the last question about being loved, love is to me the greatest gift you can give anyone. And truly getting love back allows you to have those feelings and keep them more at the surface as far as treating other people with kindness and compassion.
What were you most wrong about?
Well, I was most wrong about marriage and what marriage was and what I wanted out of marriage. I was 24 when I met Lynn. I was dating a guy that was on the U of W football team, and Bruce was still in my life on and off. And at 24, a lot of my friends were married and beginning families, and I wanted that too. I wanted, just like most girls, I wanted a loving husband, I wanted children, I wanted a home of my own. And when I met Lynn, he, seemed so grown up. He was 26, and he had a steady job, and, he was living his life, and he seemed so much more worldly, and he was, than my football player or even Bruce. And I counted that in too seriously as far as how important that was. I'm really not sure why Lynn married me, because I found out after I married him, he was quite the playboy. And he knew I was a virgin because I wouldn't go to bed with him prior to marriage. But we were way too different. Our values were way too different. And I certainly jumped into that marriage not even knowing him. I just was in a hurry to get on with my life. And that was really my biggest mistake. Obviously, I have 2 wonderful daughters from that marriage that I wouldn't trade for anything. But in getting married the second time to someone who really loved me and continues to really love me and considers me important to his happiness, the difference is just incredible. And I'm glad I had the courage to get out of that unhappy marriage, as difficult as it was. I felt such guilt for my girls, but I'm a much better mother and a much better person living my life in a happy environment.
What was your parenting philosophy?
Well, the experts say you parent the way you've been parented. And so I was fairly strict. And I think I was lenient on other things, like my mother. So I was like my father and like my mother. But the one thing I really tried to teach my kids was, you are responsible for your decisions. If you make a bad decision, you're the only one that it will truly affect in the long run. You may hurt other people in the beginning, but a bad decision will follow you for a long time. So think about what it is you're making a decision about. And I don't know, I just wanted to love my two girls. I wanted them to know that even if I disciplined them, I loved them, and to grow up with those feelings, because I know they felt I was the heavy hand.
What was the happiest moment of your life?
Truly, the happiest moment of my life is when Buzz and I said, "I do," in front of all our children. I knew that he loved me. I was really in love with him. And I had that feeling of security that no matter what kind of garbage got thrown at us in our lives, together we could, get through it. And that's continued. How fortunate and blessed I've been for almost 40 years to have this man's love surround me.
Are there any sayings that ring true for you?
Well, the one that my father used to preach was, when you make your bed, you have to lie in it. And that's a very old saying, and the same sort of thing that I was trying to teach my girls with different words, that when you make a decision, it will follow you. And I truly do believe that. It's one of the reasons I stayed in my first marriage for 15 years. I'd made a lot of promises in the beginning, and I felt that those were decisions that I made. They weren't the best decisions, but they were my decisions, and I needed to be serious about that, which I was. And I think that's true of everything that when I've tried to decide things in that future. I may have made one bad decision that followed me, but I think that I've been much more thoughtful in things that I've decided since that time. I don't know if I really answered that.
Are going to pertain to your family and your family tree. The first question is, who is the oldest relative you remember?
Well, we were a small family in comparison to my friends and things that had cousins to play with and that sort of thing. My father had a sister and a mother in England, somewhere around London, who none of us met, and my mother and my father actually never got back to England to see them. It was too expensive, and it was too long a trip to go over there. At any rate, the year my father was killed was the next year my parents had planned financially to go back and see where my father was born, etc. Anyway, I know he had a sister that we never met, and the oldest relative that I had was my mother had an aunt. Her name was Anne Oliver, and we called her Aunt Tanny. The Tanny was from obviously Anne, and as little kids we couldn't separate the Aunt Anne, so we called her Aunt Tanny. And she was my mother's aunt. She had never married. She was engaged to a man with the last name of Rutherford who never married her and died before they ever died. She did have a diamond ring, which was her engagement ring, but she never married. My mother had a brother, Harold, who lived in the East somewhere in Quebec, and we didn't meet him until I was close to an adult. But Aunt Annie was probably the oldest relative that we had that we knew. And she lived in Winnipeg, just maybe 3 or 4 streets over from where we lived.
Is there anyone in your family that your children haven't met that you would like them to know about?
I'm alive right now that I would like my children to meet. My mother's brother's children, Charlotte and Alan are their names. They still live in the East. I have met Charlotte, but I haven't seen Alan. He didn't respond when Buzz and I took our trip cross country for me to find him. I would have loved my children to have known my father, who died before they were born, and my Aunt Tanny. Other than that, I never met my grandmother, my father's mother. My mother's parents were both dead, and so I never knew any grandparents. But Aunt Tanny and certainly my father, I would have loved my children to have known him.
What did your family do to celebrate holidays when you were growing up?
My father traveled in his aviation business jobs, unpredictably sometimes if there was an airplane accident somewhere, but the holidays I remember were certainly Christmas and New Year's.
How about Halloween, too?
And, Halloween. Buzz reminds me of Halloween. My mother loved Halloween. And as a child, a small child, I hated Halloween. My mother always got dressed up in just the most outlandish outfits and would go around the neighborhood terrorizing them. And she always wanted me to go with her or my sisters, which we hated because she looked so awful in the costumes she would put on. They were elaborate and detailed that we didn't want to be with her. So I think she enjoyed Halloween way more than we did. She had a great time. Christmas was the holiday that I remember that we were all together. Dad was home, and he never cooked during the year, but he did cook special things at Christmas. A plum pudding with a hard sauce that I remember, and he would do the turkey and things like that. But it was always so wonderful to have all of us together for that holiday. My mother loved Christmas, and I do too. And she really put her heart and soul into Christmas. My poor dad would have to get 2 or 3 trees before she was satisfied that the tree was big enough and bushy enough and that sort of thing. And it was almost a game, but it wasn't. I think my father was truly frustrated with my mother every Christmas trying to please her with the tree. But we celebrated as a small family. Aunt Tanny would join us, but no one else really. And on Boxing Day, we always were told that was the day that we should be home, playing with our toys and that sort of thing. So it really was a homey type holiday. New Year's was, Mom and Dad would sometimes go out. they would get all dressed up and go to the flying club and celebrate New Year's. And as kids, certainly young kids, it wasn't a big party for us.
Do you have a story to tell about each of your children's births?
Neener Beener came a month early. She was due actually on Lynn's birthday, July 6th, and I went into labor on June 9th. Right at dinner time, my membranes ruptured and I had water all over the place. It wasn't really a story. I mean, I went in at 6 o'clock in the evening and she was born at 6 the next morning. It was a very long night, and I remember thinking, I just can't do this one more time. I can't endure one more pain. And the nurses were obviously busy, and they gave me injections of Demerol, which all that did was make me throw up. So it was a miserable 12 hours. My OB doc came in at 6 in the morning and started yelling at the nurses because they hadn't called him, and he had promised me what he called a pudental block. So I would be more comfortable, but it was too late in my labor at that point to give it to me, apparently. So it was a forceps delivery, and both Janine and I had a lot of Demerol on board from the night. So the next morning, I remember the nurse bringing in this little bassinet and putting Janine in the bassinet and saying, okay, put your light on if you need anything. I couldn't even get out of bed. And I remember thinking how awful it would be if something happened to Janine as I was sleeping off my Demerol, but fortunately nothing did happen. Kelsey was the opposite. She was 3 weeks late, and my OB doc was moving to Colorado, and his family were already there waiting for me to give delivery to Kelsey so they could reunite as a family. He would call me every day. It just made me crazy because I didn't know how to speed up labor. I took cod liver oil. I ate pizza. I did all these things that people said would start labor, and nothing did. So 3 weeks later, I finally did go into very mild labor, and she was born on the afternoon of the 16th of September. Much easier labor and another forceps delivery.
How would you describe each of your children?
Lynanne Janine Smith was a live wire. She was a busy little girl. She wasn't interested in being in the kitchen with me and making cookies and that kind of thing. She would color Easter eggs and things like that, but she wasn't really interested in the things I thought little kids would be interested in. She was busy. She wanted to play outside mostly. And when we had Honey, a golden retriever, Honey was her best buddy. They played outside together a lot. Kelsey was just the opposite. She was interested in gardening and helped me plant my daisies and my flowers, and she also loved to be in the kitchen and make cookies or anything I was making. And she played with her dolls and Barbies in the house, more or less, until she got interested in horses. But they were entirely different kids. I think they're still very different from one another in what they like to do and that sorts of thing.
Is there anything that you would like to teach or would have wanted to teach either of your children separately or together?
I did try to teach both my kids how to sew. Kelsey was interested in learning when I was making Barbie doll clothes for her, but Janine wasn't interested when she was young. But I remember Buzz and I bought her a sewing machine for her birthday one year. She came up to Anacortes from Seattle, and we gave her this sewing machine. And she said, "What am I supposed to do with this?" And I said, "Well, make quilts." And at that time, I was starting to make quilts. And Janine did get interested. She learned to sew and learned to make quilts like I was, and that gave us a common interest together, and she quite enjoyed it. I think when she got married to David, she lost interest in sewing, but she did follow through and finish a couple of quilts she had making. Kelsey has not sewn hardly at all, I don't think. She makes handmade, hand-sewn, really darling Christmas things. But that's probably all. Doesn't sound like I tried very hard to teach. But you have to have somebody who's willing to learn on the other end, too.
Did you ever find out anything surprising about any of your relatives or family tree?
Again, our family tree was pretty small. I never knew anybody who knew my relatives in Great Britain, so there weren't any stories or anything like that. And my mother's relatives, again, she had one brother that lived somewhere in Quebec. And I just don't have anything to add to that. Aunt Tanny, we never really talked about family. She was my mother's aunt. So she was our great aunt, but she didn't really talk much about the family either.
Can you tell us a little bit more about how your parents met and where they lived and what life was like for them?
My mother was living in Grand-Mère, Quebec. She had been brought home from college to help my grandfather take care of his wife, my mother's mother, who, I'm not sure, but it sounded like she had developed dementia. My father had been brought over from London, England by a fellow by the name of McCurdy, who flew the plane, the Silver Dart, across the Atlantic, which was a first. And he was pretty famous, and he brought my father over to Canada to help open Labrador and get supplies in and out of the miners and the few people that lived in Labrador. And my mother also played golf, and there was some party at the golf club, and my McCurdy had invited my father and introduced them, my mother and my father, and that's how they met. And my father courted my mother, and they were married maybe a year or so later.
Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again, because a vision softly creeping left its scenes while I was sleeping. And the vision that was planted in my brain still remains within the sound of silence. In restless dreams I walked alone, narrow streets of cobble stone. Neath the halo of a street lamp, I turn my collar to the cold and damp. When my eyes were stabbed by the flash of a neon light that split the night and touched the sound of silence. And in the naked light I saw 10,000 people, maybe more. People talking without speaking. People hearing without listening. People writing songs and voices never shared. And no one dared disturb the sound of silence. Fool said I, you do not know. Silence like a cancer grows. Hear my words that I might teach you. Take my arms and I might reach you. But my words, like silent raindrops, fell and echoed in the wind.
These next few questions are going to be about your final wishes. What details about your funeral are important to you?
Boy, these are tough questions. I guess the most important thing to me is that the people that love me and that I love are there to say goodbye, and that they all have a positive memory of me as a friend, a mother, a grandmother, an aunt, a sister, and I guess that's really all. I hope that if I go first, my husband's kids are there to comfort him. And if he goes first, that the children are there to comfort me. I just turned 80. I don't feel 80. I don't know what 80 is supposed to feel like, I guess, but I know I'm entering the last chapter of my life. And it's a little bit intimidating, actually, when I think about it. There's so many threads to tie up and so many different ways you say goodbye. Buzz and I have always said it'd be wonderful if we died together. We're so intertwined and close in our love for each other that it's difficult for me to see myself without him carrying on if he were to die first. I know certainly that I will carry on, and my children and Allison, Buzz's daughter, will help me do that. But I just can't imagine my life without him. So I think and hope that I go first. And I'd love to see Buzz find a female friend after I die to cook for him and take care of him.
Are there any physical markers in your memory that you want to be able to visit? You want the children to be able to visit after you've passed?
Well, I'm struggling as to what I do in my memory with Jackson, Wyoming, that was really a beloved home for me for many years. Somebody asked me the other day how many years I lived there, and I said 15, but that's not true. It was close to 20 because I left Janine and Kelsey's father when I had lived there 15 years, and then Buzz and I were married, 4.5 or so when we moved. I will always have those mountains in my heart, I think. And I think my two girls will too. I think they will fondly go back to Jackson. Our last trip, which was this summer of 2021, was really disturbing to me to see the hordes of people, and that's not what's in my mind or my heart about Jackson. But certainly that's been progress there. I think my previous homes, because my father moved us several times. I was born in Winnipeg. We moved to Ottawa when I was 13, and then moved back to Edmonton when I was 16. I really didn't bond there. I was the new kid in school all the time when we moved, and so I don't have that feeling of childhood homes and that sort of thing to pass on to my kids.
Would you like to be buried, cremated, or something else?
I think that most of us have this ideal thing that we want done with our bodies when we leave this earth. And, you know, if I had my big wishes that Buzz and I would be cremated and our ashes would be mixed together, but I don't think that's going to happen. He doesn't want to be cremated. We do have our plots here in Anacortes, so I think we will be buried side by side. And I hope our children will come and talk to us. Talk to us if they have a problem, or talk to us when things are going well for them. Because I believe that connection is always still there. I talk to my mother and my father both still today. It's just, if one person dies and the other one lives many years after that, everything becomes a little bit more awkward.
Are there any traditions you would like to see your children carry on?
Well, I don't know if they're traditions, but I would like them to keep family ties together, since we're a split family with Buzz's children and my children. But I would like to see them make an effort to get together at least every other year and still stay connected, whether it be with family reunions or visiting each other, but some traditional way of getting together. It'd be nice if they had Thanksgiving in July every year. I think we did that this year, and I thought it was a wonderful reunion. I loved seeing all the kids and grandkids. I also would like to see my two girls give back to their communities with volunteering in something that their community needs. I think that it just really makes one person feel good about what they've given back to an area that they have lived in and loved. And so, yes, I would, both Buzz and I have volunteered many hours to our community. I would like to see my children do the same.
Do you have all your affairs in order? And who should people contact to understand what your final wishes are when you pass?
Well, if Buzz is still living, he would be the person to contact. If he is deceased before me, then it certainly would be either Janine or Kelsey. We have our things mostly tied up. I don't think the bow's tied on them yet, but I think the one thing that isn't clear is I have some wonderful jewelry and I have pieces that I want to go to specific people. And I do need to write that down. Every time I try to get my girls together to do this, they don't want to do it because they don't want to talk about it. They think it's depressing, but it's something that surely the person that's going to be the one leaving the earth, it's important. So no, I need to finish that up, and then pretty much I think our wills are specific.
Who would you list to make medical decisions for you, and what would you like people to know about those decisions?
Well, I certainly have discussed with my primary care doctor what I want done and what I don't want done. I certainly don't want to live on if I developed some dementia of some kind and didn't even know Buzz or my children. I really wouldn't want to live any longer, but I'm not sure that I can control that, except to tell people that if I were to have a sudden death or, a stroke or something like that, again, I don't want to live if I can't be productive afterwards. So I wouldn't want any code type things to be done if that were determined by a CT or a MRI. I would want to just have comfort measures only. We do in this state have a law that allows us to take our own lives. If you jump through the hoops, the problem is by the time you get the hoops done, you may not be able to control that. But I would put Kelsey in charge of that if Buzz weren't able to, and medically she would know what I would want and what I don't want.
Okay, last but not least, how would you like to be remembered, and what legacy would you hope to leave behind?
A legacy, I don't know, that sounds pretty important. I would hope that people that knew me, especially my family, would remember me, that I was kind, and that I cared about people. I have been a nurse most all of my life, and I have loved being a nurse, and so I would like to be remembered as a caregiving nurse and somebody who cared about their family, tried to bring their family together.
tu aloha e o mai Kau mi ka vai ma puna a lei ka poli ma hei ka vai